year was 1918, and the world seemed to teeter on the edge of exhaustion. 4 long years of global conflict had left nations drained of manpower, resources, and the very resilience of their citizens. Cities across Europe were swollen with refugees, military hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers, and the transportation networks that carried armies and supplies now also carried the subtle, invisible threat of disease. People moved in constant streams, often unaware of how interconnected their lives had become or how fragile the boundaries of health truly were. The war, intended to end all wars, had already claimed tens of millions of lives. But even as armistices were contemplated and peace negotiations began, a new kind of crisis was quietly taking shape, a crisis that would surpass even the devastation of the battlefield, leaving its mark on nearly every corner of the globe. In many ways, the conditions for disaster were already in place long before the first whispers of illness began to circulate. The 20th century had brought remarkable advances in medicine, but these achievements existed alongside profound ignorance. Physicians were beginning to understand bacteria, and vaccines and antiseptics had begun to save lives in ways unimaginable just a few decades earlier. Yet viruses remained an elusive frontier. Influenza was recognized, but it was largely treated as a seasonal nuisance, a force of nature as familiar and fleeting as winter winds. Most people, including doctors, believed that careful hygiene, isolation of the sick, and basic public health measures were sufficient to control outbreaks. They had no reason to suspect that a virus could move with such speed, strike with such ferocity, or reach such improbable corners of the globe. Meanwhile, the war had transformed the way humanity moved. Millions of soldiers were concentrated in barracks, training camps, and trenches, often living shoulder to shoulder under conditions that encouraged the spread of disease. Railways transported troops across continents, and ships carried them across oceans. Cities were crowded with displaced populations, and factories, offices, and schools were filled beyond capacity. In this environment, the invisible barriers that normally slowed the spread of illness, distance, isolation, natural immunity, had all but disappeared. Every cough or sneeze became a potential vector, every journey a conduit for contagion. And yet, in the midst of such immense human movement and suffering, the first signs of a new influenza were subtle. In Kansas, in March of 1918, a few soldiers reported to the base infirmary with fevers, headaches, and body aches. It was hardly remarkable. These symptoms were common, easily explained by fatigue or stress. The doctors, too, took little notice, recording the cases as routine and continuing their work under the assumption that influenza was predictable, manageable, and contained. But in this assumption lay the fatal error. The virus that had begun its quiet journey across the United States carried characteristics unlike anything doctors had seen before. It struck not only the very young and the elderly, as typical flu viruses did, but also healthy young adults, the very men most crucial to the ongoing war effort. Its lethality was subtle at first, hiding behind a veneer of normalcy. Soldiers recovered quickly in many cases, while in others, sudden deterioration occurred without warning. As the weeks passed, small clusters of severe illness began to appear in other military camps, and reports traveled slowly, filtered through military bureaucracy and limited communication channels. Yet because the outbreak was scattered and the deaths were initially unremarkable in scale, it did not command immediate attention. Across the Atlantic, Europe was barely aware of what was unfolding in North America. Cities were busy tending to their own wounded and displaced populations. Governments were consumed with strategies to end the war, manage alliances, and prepare for peace talks. In Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, influenza was a known adversary, but it was assumed to be just another hazard among many, a winter flu season exaggerated by the stresses of wartime. There were no alarms, no widespread understanding that a new, highly contagious, and unusually lethal virus had begun to circulate. Public health infrastructure, already stretched thin by the demands of the war, was poorly equipped to detect, report, or respond to what would soon become a global catastrophe. As spring turned to summer, the movement of troops accelerated. Soldiers who had trained together in small towns and military bases now began to travel to ports, embark on ships, and participate in maneuvers across countries and oceans. The virus moved with them. One by one, military camps in the United States reported small but troubling outbreaks. Yet these were isolated incidents in the eyes of military administrators who were accustomed to dealing with disease. Influenza, after all, was expected to appear, flare briefly, and fade. Few understood that what they were observing was not an ordinary outbreak, but the first ripple of a wave that would soon crash across the world. The societal conditions of 1918 amplified the virus's potential. Malnutrition was widespread in both Europe and the Americas, as the diversion of food to armies and the disruption of agriculture created scarcity in civilian populations. Overcrowding in urban slums, combined with poor sanitation, made cities fertile ground for contagion. Transportation networks designed to support the war effort, railways, ports, and shipping lines, unintentionally facilitated the rapid spread of disease. And while the medical community had achieved great confidence in bacteriology, its understanding of viral pathogens remained rudimentary. The invisible enemy could move freely through the human population without warning, with no way to detect or anticipate its next target. It is important to remember that at this stage, there was no public panic. The virus had not yet revealed its full character, and many assumed these outbreaks were routine, a minor inconvenience in a world already defined by crisis. Life continued with an uneasy normalcy. Soldiers drilled, factories operated, markets remained open, and families carried on as best they could. Yet beneath this veneer of routine, the groundwork for a disaster of unprecedented scale was being laid. The first casualties, soldiers who fell ill in a matter of days, were harbingers of what was to come. Each case, each death, was a node in an intricate network of transmission, a prelude to a pandemic that would reach continents, disrupt economies, and leave millions dead in its wake. By late spring, the virus had begun to spread beyond military camps into surrounding towns. Communities that had been insulated by geography and circumstance suddenly found themselves exposed. The movement of soldiers and the slow dissemination of news meant that ordinary citizens had little warning and even less guidance. Local doctors, unprepared for the unusual severity of the illness, struggled to differentiate it from seasonal influenza or other respiratory infections. Treatments were basic and largely ineffective. Rest, nutrition, and simple remedies, none of which could slow the rapid progression of the disease in severe cases. Hospitals, already strained by wartime injuries and limited staff, faced the first signs of overload. In retrospect, it becomes clear that 1918 was a perfect storm. Social, political, and medical conditions intersected to create vulnerability on a global scale. The war had weakened societies, displaced populations, and created unprecedented patterns of human mobility. Science, though advanced for its time, lacked the tools to identify, track, or contain a virus of such potency. Communities were ill-prepared, and governments had neither the knowledge nor the infrastructure to respond effectively. The early months of 1918 were a quiet prelude, almost imperceptible, yet they contained all the ingredients for a catastrophe that would ripple through every continent, leaving scars that history would struggle to fully comprehend. And so, as the world moved through the final months of war, a hidden adversary began its inexorable march. Invisible and relentless, it would soon reveal that the end of conflict on the battlefield did not mean the end of human suffering. What began as scattered reports in small towns and military camps would soon erupt into a pandemic unlike any before, a virus that would not recognize borders, armies, or social class. It would move swiftly, invisibly, and indiscriminately, altering the course of history in ways that no strategist, politician, or physician could have anticipated. The world, already weary, was about to be tested in a manner that would leave few untouched and change the very understanding of disease, mortality, and human interconnectedness forever. In the early months of 1918, as reports of unusual influenza began to appear in scattered military camps and small towns, medicine was caught in a paradox of progress and limitation. The medical world of the early 20th century was proud of its accomplishments. Bacteriology had transformed the understanding of infection. Vaccines for diseases like smallpox and diphtheria were increasingly effective, and antiseptic techniques had begun to drastically reduce mortality in hospitals. Surgeons could operate with a precision unimaginable a generation earlier, and the concept of public health had taken root in many nations. Physicians believed that science had largely tamed the microbial world, that germs could be identified, tracked, and controlled with reason and diligence. Yet beneath this veneer of mastery, critical gaps remained. Viruses, invisible to the microscopes of the time, were largely unknown entities, their mechanisms mysterious and their potential underestimated. Influenza, while recognized as a recurring seasonal threat, was seen as a minor nuisance compared with the diseases that could be definitively diagnosed and treated. The prevailing confidence in medical science was both remarkable and dangerously incomplete. Hospitals in 1918 were structured to handle the injuries of war, epidemics of known diseases, and the seasonal surges of influenza, which typically came and went without causing large-scale devastation. Physicians relied on observation, rudimentary laboratory testing, and practical experience. Treatments were limited, primarily supportive, and centered on rest, hydration, and basic remedies for fever and discomfort. Antibiotics, still decades away, did not exist to treat secondary bacterial infections that often complicated influenza cases. When confronted with a rapidly progressing, unusually virulent virus, doctors were largely unarmed. They could monitor symptoms, isolate the sick when possible, and attempt rudimentary treatments, but the fundamental cause remained elusive. This combination of medical authority and ignorance created a fragile equilibrium, one that would soon be shattered. Military medicine, in particular, operated under unique pressures. The United States, Britain, France, and other combatant nations maintained vast medical corps, tasked with keeping soldiers fit for duty, managing the wounded, and preventing outbreaks from decimating armies. Hospitals and training camps were often overcrowded, staffed by overworked physicians and nurses, and stocked with limited supplies. Influenza, familiar but underestimated, was treated as a minor occupational hazard. In the early spring, when clusters of flu-like illness appeared in bases, such as Camp Funston in Kansas, medical officers recorded the symptoms methodically: fever, headache, fatigue, sore throat, and body aches. For many, these symptoms would resolve in a week or two. Yet some patients deteriorated suddenly, with high fevers and violent respiratory distress. Medical staff, unfamiliar with this pattern, initially assumed these were complications or unusual reactions rather than evidence of a novel threat. Public health authorities also operated under constraints that would soon prove catastrophic. Governments, stretched thin by the war effort, prioritized battlefield medicine, munitions production, and the management of social unrest over proactive disease surveillance. Data collection was slow, inconsistent, and heavily filtered through military and bureaucratic hierarchies. Reports of illness traveled slowly, often delayed or diluted by concern for morale and the potential impact on recruitment and production. Newspapers, which might have informed the public, were frequently censored in wartime, especially in Europe, suppressing the spread of accurate information about disease. These structural limitations meant that early warning signs of a pandemic were effectively invisible to most of the population, and even to many within the medical community. The understanding of influenza itself was still rudimentary. While the disease was recognized as viral in nature by some scientists, the ability to isolate, identify, and study viruses was limited. Diagnostic tools were primitive. Laboratory techniques could detect bacteria, but viruses were undetectable without the advanced electron microscopy that would not exist for decades. Physicians relied on symptom patterns, mortality rates, and clinical observation to track outbreaks. In the absence of precise tools, Influenza was often conflated with other respiratory infections, and the virulence of specific strains could not be anticipated. This meant that a virus with the unusual capacity to infect healthy young adults and to kill rapidly in a subset of cases could circulate largely unchecked, its danger underestimated until it had already spread widely. Even as doctors grappled with the limitations of science, public perception reinforced a sense of complacency. Influenza was widely regarded as inevitable but manageable, a seasonal hazard rather than an existential threat. People went about their daily lives, working, shopping, attending social events, largely unaware of the hidden danger that had begun to circulate through military camps, cities, and towns. This perception, grounded in prior experience, would prove disastrous when confronted with a strain that defied conventional patterns. Families, accustomed to influenza as a transient nuisance, were unprepared for a disease that would overwhelm households with alarming speed. The intersection of war and medicine was particularly consequential. Soldiers, often malnourished and fatigued, were uniquely susceptible to infectious disease. Military camps were densely populated, with men living and training in close quarters. The movement of troops, both domestically and internationally, provided the perfect conduit for transmission. Ships, trains, and convoys carried not only soldiers but also pathogens across continents. The virus, moving silently among populations with little natural immunity, was poised to exploit the logistical networks designed for human mobility and wartime efficiency. Doctors recognized individual cases but were unable to anticipate the speed and scale of the spread. Compounding the challenge, secondary bacterial infections, which could exacerbate influenza cases, were poorly understood and largely untreatable. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and other complications frequently claimed lives, yet doctors lacked effective interventions. Treatments were largely supportive, relying on rest, nutrition, and rudimentary medicines that could ease symptoms but not halt the progression of severe illness. Even experienced physicians were confronted with situations that defied expectation. Patients who appeared stable could collapse within hours, overwhelming the limited resources of hospitals and infirmaries. Across the Atlantic, the situation was mirrored in Europe, though with variations shaped by geography, infrastructure, and the war's ongoing demands. Medical systems were stretched to the breaking point, hospitals filled with wounded soldiers and civilian casualties, and physicians tasked with managing a broad array of health crises. Influenza outbreaks were noted in Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, but the virus's unusual patterns, its predilection for young adults, its rapid progression, and its global mobility were not yet understood. Governments struggled to balance wartime priorities with a growing public health threat, often relying on incomplete or inaccurate data. The limitations of medicine in 1918 were both practical and conceptual. Practitioners understood disease in terms of known pathogens and established interventions. Bacteria could be seen, identified, and in some cases neutralized. Viruses were largely theoretical, understood in principle but impervious to direct observation or control. Public health measures, while effective against many infectious diseases, were limited in their ability to halt the spread of a highly contagious, fast-moving virus. The tools available, quarantine, isolation, hygiene, and rudimentary antiviral remedies, could slow but not prevent transmission, particularly in the context of global war and massive human movement. Amid these limitations, medical professionals displayed extraordinary dedication. Physicians and nurses worked tirelessly, often under exhausting and dangerous conditions. They documented symptoms, experimented with treatments, and offered care despite the inadequate tools at their disposal. Their efforts, though heroic, were constrained by the limits of contemporary science and the unprecedented nature of the threat. Hospitals were filled to capacity, and mortality rates began to rise in ways that defied conventional understanding. Every death was a reminder of both human vulnerability and the gap between knowledge and reality. By the time the first wave of influenza spread more broadly in mid-1918, medicine had already demonstrated both its strengths and its weaknesses. It had established infrastructure, expertise, and methodologies that could respond to known diseases. It had created a global network of doctors, nurses, and hospitals capable of providing care at scale. Yet it lacked the ability to understand, detect, or prevent a virus that defied established norms. The early months of 1918 revealed that medical science, though advanced, was still profoundly limited when confronted with a pathogen capable of exploiting every vulnerability in society. The story of medicine in 1918 is therefore not only one of limitation, but also of preparation. The knowledge, tools, and systems that existed at the time would prove both inadequate and foundational. They allowed for observation, documentation, and eventual understanding, providing the basis for later public health reforms and scientific breakthroughs. But in the moment, as the virus quietly circulated through military camps, towns, and cities, medicine was a fragile shield, capable of mitigating some suffering but powerless to stop a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. In retrospect, the paradox of 1918 medicine is clear. It was a world confident in its capabilities, yet vulnerable to the invisible. Physicians believed they could predict, treat, and manage disease, yet the tools of observation, intervention, and prevention were incomplete. The emerging influenza strain exploited every gap in understanding, every limitation in infrastructure, and every assumption about human immunity. What seemed at first to be a manageable seasonal illness would, in a matter of months, reveal itself as a global pandemic capable of reshaping societies, straining healthcare systems, and challenging the very foundations of early 20th century medical science. By the spring of 1918, the influenza virus had already begun to stir quietly in small, seemingly unremarkable corners of the world. In rural towns and military camps alike, people began to fall ill with a disease that at first appeared familiar. Soldiers reported to the infirmary with fever, chills, body aches, and fatigue, symptoms that could easily have been dismissed as the lingering effects of cold weather, overexertion, or the constant strain of military life. Doctors took note, but the pattern seemed no different from the usual seasonal influenza. In many ways, the first infections were deceptively ordinary, blending seamlessly into the background of an already strained society. What distinguished these early cases, though, was subtle and easily overlooked. While most patients recovered within a few days, a small but significant minority did not. Healthy young adults, men and women in the prime of life, began to succumb to sudden respiratory distress. Their lungs, once resilient, became overwhelmed by fluid and inflammation, and the disease progressed at an alarming speed. Physicians who had treated countless cases of influenza were confounded. The symptoms were recognizable, but their severity and unpredictability were not. Reports of these unusual cases were logged in medical journals, sent up the chain of command in military hospitals, and occasionally noted in local newspapers, but the dispersed nature of the outbreaks prevented a coherent understanding of their significance. The earliest clusters were often dismissed as anomalies or localized epidemics. In Camp Funston, Kansas, where hundreds of soldiers fell ill over the course of several weeks, military doctors recorded the cases with routine clinical notes, noting fever, cough, and prostration. Yet some patients developed hemorrhaging in the lungs. Others experienced profound exhaustion that left them unable to rise from bed, and some simply died within a matter of days. The irregularity of these severe outcomes made it difficult to anticipate the virus's trajectory. Military administrators, focused on training schedules and logistical concerns, did not initially recognize the broader implications. In other parts of the United States and across Europe, similar patterns emerged in scattered locations, but the disease was still seen as an ordinary flu season rather than the beginning of a global pandemic. The virus's subtlety in these early stages allowed it to spread undetected. Soldiers traveled between camps, and recruits were rotated across the country, often before they had fully recovered. Cities, already crowded with returning soldiers, workers, and displaced populations provided fertile ground for transmission. Public spaces, transportation networks, and communal living arrangements facilitated the invisible movement of the pathogen. In towns across the Midwest, rural communities that had previously experienced influenza only sporadically found themselves confronted with waves of illness that arrived without warning and dissipated almost as quickly, leaving uncertainty in their wake. One of the most confounding aspects of this initial phase was the virus's selective lethality. Unlike typical influenza, which disproportionately affected the very young, the elderly, and those with pre-existing conditions, this strain struck down healthy adults with alarming frequency. Doctors documented the deaths of men and women in their 20s and 30s, individuals who would normally be considered resilient. Families, schools, and workplaces were suddenly confronted with loss that seemed both random and incomprehensible. The psychological impact of these deaths, while not yet widely recognized, began to ripple through communities, eroding the sense of normalcy and security. Medical understanding lagged far behind the virus's spread. Physicians could describe the symptoms, attempt supportive care, and isolate the sick where possible, but they could not identify the cause, predict the outcome, or prevent the next wave. The early cases were recorded as influenza, but the peculiar severity in healthy adults hinted at something unprecedented. Researchers began to note patterns. Outbreaks often appeared in clusters, sometimes separated by hundreds of miles, and mortality rates varied dramatically. This inconsistency puzzled the medical community and delayed the realization that a highly transmissible and unusually virulent virus was circulating. Compounding the difficulty was the role of wartime secrecy. Governments, particularly in Europe, were heavily invested in maintaining public morale and controlling information. Reports of disease outbreaks were frequently censored or downplayed, making it difficult for public health officials and citizens alike to understand the scope of the problem. Even in the United States, where media was less tightly controlled, the significance of the early cases was obscured by the sheer scale of wartime reporting and the focus on military events. Newspapers reported the illnesses with brief anecdotes, often without context, and the general public had little reason to take the threat seriously. The virus, moving silently and invisibly, gained precious time in which to spread. Despite the limited awareness, the human cost was already evident in small communities. Families watched members fall ill with alarming speed, sometimes recovering, sometimes dying within days. Hospitals, though not yet overwhelmed, began to experience localized surges of patients, straining the limited medical resources available. Doctors and nurses, already stretched thin by the demands of wartime healthcare, faced the challenge of providing care under conditions that were often chaotic and under-resourced. Their dedication was immense, but their tools were rudimentary, and the virus demonstrated a resilience that rendered conventional interventions largely ineffective. The social impact of these early outbreaks was subtle but meaningful. Schools occasionally closed for short periods, workplaces saw absenteeism rise, and public gatherings were disrupted. Yet for the most part, life continued. People were conditioned by war to expect hardship and disruption, and they adapted to the initial waves of illness without fully recognizing the magnitude of the threat. In retrospect, these early disruptions were the first indicators of a pandemic that would touch every aspect of life. But at the time, they were often seen as minor inconveniences or the natural consequences of seasonal illness. As spring turned to early summer, the virus began to display patterns that would become characteristic of its later waves. It traveled along the pathways of human mobility, jumping from camp to city to town, exploiting networks of transportation and commerce. Its capacity to infect large numbers of healthy adults simultaneously, coupled with a variable but sometimes extremely high mortality rate, made it uniquely dangerous. Yet in this early stage, these characteristics were poorly understood and largely underestimated by the medical establishment. The virus was shaping itself into a global threat, but few could yet see the contours of the disaster to come. Researchers and physicians began to document the anomalies, noting that this influenza differed from previous seasons in both intensity and reach. Clinical reports described sudden onset of high fever, severe fatigue, and respiratory distress. Autopsies revealed congestion and hemorrhaging in the lungs, sometimes accompanied by secondary bacterial infections that hastened death. Yet the absence of a unifying theory or understanding of viral pathogens left these observations disconnected. Each outbreak was seen in isolation, a puzzling anomaly rather than part of a larger pattern. The geographical spread of the virus in these early months illustrates the interconnectedness of human society at the time. From military camps in the American Midwest to small towns in Europe, the pathogen moved silently, carried by people who were themselves unaware of their own infection. Ports, railways, and troop movements acted as unwitting conduits. Each movement of soldiers or civilians created new nodes of infection, linking distant locations through the simple act of travel. In this sense, the early outbreaks were not isolated incidents, but the first signs of a pandemic that would ultimately traverse oceans and continents. Even as medical professionals began to recognize the unusual severity of these early cases, they were constrained by the tools and knowledge available to them. Isolation and supportive care were the primary responses, but these measures could only mitigate, not prevent, the spread of the virus. Hospitals were limited in capacity, and resources, such as trained nurses and medical supplies, were unevenly distributed. Public health authorities faced the daunting task of monitoring outbreaks while navigating the political and social constraints of wartime society. In this environment, the virus moved with little resistance, taking advantage of both human vulnerability and institutional limitations. By the end of spring 1918, it was becoming increasingly clear that influenza was no longer a predictable seasonal nuisance. Subtle but alarming patterns in mortality, the unusual susceptibility of young adults, and the speed of transmission hinted at a disease unlike any previously encountered. Yet the full scale of the threat remained hidden, obscured by limited observation, wartime censorship, and a fragmented nature of early reporting. For most people, the world continued with a tenuous sense of normalcy, unaware that the foundations of everyday life were being quietly shaken by a virus that would soon erupt into a global catastrophe. In retrospect, the early months of 1918 can be seen as a period of quiet prelude, a stage in which the influenza virus established the conditions for its eventual global spread. Its initial movements were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet they laid the groundwork for a pandemic that would claim millions of lives, disrupt societies, and challenge the assumptions of medicine, governance, and daily life. The virus revealed the vulnerabilities of a world already strained by war, demonstrating how easily human activity, mobility, and social organization could amplify the reach of disease. These early outbreaks were the first visible threads of a story that would unfold with devastating clarity, transforming the understanding of influenza and reshaping the modern world's relationship with epidemic disease. By the early summer of 1918, it was becoming increasingly evident that the influenza virus was not confined to isolated military camps or rural communities. The movements of soldiers, already immense due to the ongoing First World War, provided an unwitting network for the pathogen, accelerating its reach and intensity. Military logistics, designed to transport men and material efficiently across continents, now served as a conduit for contagion. Trains carried thousands of soldiers from training facilities to ports, where ships waited to transport them across oceans to the European theater. Barracks and encampments, built for efficiency rather than health, were densely packed, and the soldiers themselves often lived in unsanitary conditions with limited access to nutritious food and adequate rest. The very infrastructure intended to sustain military campaigns now amplified the virus's spread, creating an unprecedented vector that transcended both geography and national boundaries. In the crowded confines of military camps, the virus thrived. Men lived shoulder to shoulder in tents and barracks, sharing utensils, bedding, and breathing space. Latrines were often inadequate, and hygiene practices were inconsistent. The combination of physical proximity, poor sanitation, and constant physical exertion produced ideal conditions for a pathogen adapted to exploit human vulnerability. The virus's transmission was facilitated not by exotic or mysterious mechanisms, but by the simple realities of daily life. Close contact, shared spaces, and the movement of infected individuals from one location to another. In these environments, influenza could spread silently and rapidly, sometimes overwhelming medical staff before the severity of the outbreak could be fully recognized. Ships played a particularly crucial role in disseminating the virus across borders. Troop transports, laden with thousands of soldiers, provided confined environments in which influenza could spread with remarkable efficiency. A single infected individual could expose hundreds of others over the course of a voyage lasting days or weeks. Ventilation was often poor, and the close quarters of a ship made isolation of sick personnel challenging, if not impossible. When these ships arrived at ports in Europe, Asia, or other continents, they introduced the virus into new populations, often before local authorities were aware of its presence. The virus moved faster than the capacity of medical systems to track it, exploiting the very networks designed to sustain human activity on a global scale. The trenches of the Western Front further intensified the virus's impact. Soldiers engaged in prolonged campaigns, living in conditions of dampness, cold, and constant exposure to the elements, were particularly susceptible to respiratory illness. Nutrition was inconsistent, sleep was disrupted, and stress was omnipresent. Influenza, entering these environments, could incapacitate entire units, reducing the effectiveness of military operations and increasing the psychological strain on those still capable of fighting. Commanders, aware of the threat posed by disease but lacking precise information about its behavior, often underestimated the speed and lethality with which the virus could incapacitate their troops. The social consequences of these outbreaks were immediate and profound. Families who sent sons, brothers, and husbands to the front were suddenly confronted with the possibility that the men they had trusted to survive battle might succumb to a virus far removed from the front lines. News of illness traveled slowly, often delayed by military censorship or by the sheer logistical difficulties of wartime communication. Communities received fragmented reports of sickness, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes understated, leaving citizens uncertain and anxious. These early stages of the pandemic were marked by a tension between the perceived normality of life and the growing, unarticulated awareness of a threat that could disrupt it entirely. Influenza's impact was not uniform, and its course in different environments revealed much about both human vulnerability and social infrastructure. In urban centers where soldiers returned on leave or for rest, the virus quickly spread into the civilian population. Crowded apartment buildings, streetcars, markets, and theaters became sites of transmission. Public health authorities, already stretched thin by wartime demands and dealing with other communicable diseases, struggled to monitor the emerging patterns. Hospitals were capable of treating individual cases, but the sheer volume of patients in some cities quickly exceeded available capacity. Quarantines were difficult to enforce, and public awareness was inconsistent, with many people unaware of the unusual severity of this strain. The virus exploited inequalities in society. Poorer neighborhoods, with crowded housing and limited access to medical care, experienced higher rates of illness and death. Wealthier communities, while better equipped to isolate and treat the sick, were not immune to the broader social disruptions caused by the disease. Schools, factories, and other institutions experienced intermittent closures, absenteeism, and a constant sense of uncertainty. Social norms, accustomed to seasonal fluctuations in health, were ill-prepared for the rapid and unpredictable impact of this novel virus. Medical practitioners, already constrained by limited knowledge, faced the dual challenge of treating the ill and attempting to contain the spread. Isolation wards were set up wherever possible, but these were often insufficient for the number of patients requiring care. Nurses and doctors worked tirelessly, implementing hygiene measures and supportive treatments, but their efforts were often overwhelmed by the speed of transmission and the severity of illness. Observations from these early outbreaks would later inform the understanding of influenza's epidemiology. But at the time, each wave of illness brought new challenges that were poorly understood and difficult to manage. In rural areas, the virus moved more slowly, but its effects were no less severe. Small communities, previously insulated from the chaos of global conflict, experienced outbreaks that could decimate local populations within days. Farmers and laborers fell ill at critical points in the agricultural calendar, disrupting food production and threatening local economies. Medical care, often distant and limited in scope, could do little more than provide basic support. The virus revealed the fragility of rural infrastructure and highlighted the interconnectedness of even the most isolated populations in a world increasingly linked by war, commerce, and human mobility. The psychological dimension of these early outbreaks was significant. Soldiers, already traumatized by the horrors of combat, were confronted with a new and invisible threat that could incapacitate them without warning. Civilians, particularly those with family members in military service, experienced anxiety and fear that were amplified by the uncertainty surrounding the disease. Unlike the predictable dangers of the battlefield, influenza was invisible, indiscriminate, and capable of striking with little notice. Communities began to develop a heightened awareness of personal and public health, even as effective strategies for prevention remained largely elusive. Military authorities eventually began to recognize the potential consequences of the virus for operational effectiveness. Outbreaks in key training camps threatened to reduce troop readiness, delay deployments, and compromise the overall war effort. Efforts were made to implement basic preventive measures, such as improved sanitation, temporary quarantines, and the isolation of symptomatic individuals. Yet these measures were often inconsistent, applied unevenly across regions, and limited by logistical constraints. The virus continued to exploit gaps in human organization, moving with remarkable efficiency through networks of mobility that were essential for wartime operations. Internationally, the virus demonstrated the profound impact of human movement on disease dynamics. Troop transports, refugee movements, and the intercontinental shipment of goods all contributed to the rapid dissemination of the pathogen. Ports became critical nodes in the spread of disease as soldiers and civilians moved between continents. Influenza was no longer a local or regional phenomenon. It was beginning to establish the global footprint that would characterize the pandemic. The interconnectedness of human societies, accelerated by war, proved both a strategic advantage for nations and a critical vulnerability in the face of a novel pathogen. By mid-1918, it became clear that influenza was not a transient nuisance to be weathered. Its capacity to incapacitate soldiers, disrupt communities, and exploit human mobility marked it as a threat of unprecedented scale. Yet despite these emerging patterns, public awareness remained limited, constrained by wartime priorities, inconsistent reporting, and the invisible nature of the virus itself. In these early months, the pandemic was still unfolding quietly, its eventual magnitude unappreciated by most who would soon experience its consequences firsthand. The war, in effect, had incubated the virus. The very systems designed to sustain human activity, military logistics, transportation networks, and urban infrastructure, were repurposed by the virus to propagate itself. Dense living conditions, combined with malnutrition, stress, and fatigue, created ideal conditions for infection. Physicians, limited by knowledge and resources, struggled to respond effectively. Communities, unprepared for the speed and lethality of the disease, faced uncertainty and anxiety. In this context, influenza was no longer merely a biological phenomenon. It was a social and logistical crisis, revealing the vulnerabilities inherent in human systems and networks. In retrospect, the summer of 1918 represents a critical turning point in the pandemic narrative. The virus had moved from scattered outbreaks to a stage in which it could exploit both human biology and social organization with devastating effect. The lessons of these months about transmission, vulnerability, and the interplay between human mobility and disease would inform future public health responses, but in the moment, they were being discovered in real time, often at the cost of lives. The influenza virus, silent and relentless, had begun to demonstrate its full capacity for disruption, setting the stage for the waves of illness that would soon reach global scale, challenge medical authority, and transform societies in profound and lasting ways. By the summer of 1918, it had become increasingly apparent that the influenza virus circulating through military camps, cities, and rural communities was not an ordinary seasonal illness. Early observers, primarily physicians and public health officials, began to note patterns that defied the familiar rhythms of influenza. Mortality rates among young adults were unexpectedly high, and the progression from initial symptoms to severe respiratory distress could be astonishingly rapid. What had begun as scattered, seemingly isolated outbreaks now revealed the first signs of an epidemiological pattern that hinted at both virulence and reached far beyond what medical science had previously encountered. Physicians struggled to understand the virus's unusual behavior. Many patients presented with a sudden onset of high fever, chills, and body aches, followed within hours or days by severe inflammation in the lungs. Some exhibited hemorrhaging, which could lead to suffocation despite the patient's previously robust health. Autopsies revealed lungs filled with fluid, tissue damaged by both viral activity and secondary bacterial infections. These observations puzzled medical professionals accustomed to influenza that predominantly affected the very young, the elderly, or those with pre-existing conditions. In 1918, however, mortality was alarmingly high among individuals in their 20s and 30s, those typically considered resilient. This inversion of expected susceptibility represented a new and terrifying dimension of the disease. As the virus continued to spread, military camps became focal points for observation. Units stationed in dense barracks experienced waves of infection that could incapacitate significant portions of their personnel. Officers and medical staff recognized that the virus was capable of sweeping through populations with remarkable efficiency, yet preventive measures remained limited. Isolation and rudimentary sanitation were often insufficient, and the movement of troops to ports and battlefronts further facilitated transmission. For soldiers, the threat of influenza soon rivaled the dangers of combat itself, adding a psychological burden to the physical strain of military service. In cities, the virus began to affect civilian populations with increasing severity. Urban centers, already strained by wartime industrial demands, faced outbreaks that could overwhelm hospitals and clinics. Public health authorities attempted to monitor cases and implement containment measures, but the virus moved faster than these interventions could be applied. Schools, theaters, factories, and public transportation became sites of rapid transmission, and absenteeism rose sharply. Families confronted a frightening unpredictability. A member could fall ill and recover within days, or deteriorate rapidly, sometimes fatally, with little warning. These early civilian outbreaks highlighted the virus's capacity to exploit the social networks and infrastructure that connected communities, revealing vulnerabilities that had previously been theoretical rather than lived realities. Medical understanding of the virus remained limited. Laboratories could detect secondary bacterial infections, but the viral cause itself remained elusive. Physicians relied on observation, empirical treatments, and supportive care, rest, hydration, and basic remedies to reduce fever and ease respiratory symptoms. Antibiotics were not yet available to treat the bacterial complications that often accompanied influenza, meaning that even patients with access to attentive care could succumb unexpectedly. The absence of specific therapeutic tools highlighted the limitations of contemporary medicine and underscored the virus's capacity to outpace human knowledge. One of the most alarming aspects of this period was the virus's ability to move silently through populations. Infected individuals could carry the virus without exhibiting severe symptoms, inadvertently transmitting it to others in communal settings. Ships transporting soldiers and refugees became inadvertent incubators, and train networks facilitated its movement across regions. Even isolated rural communities were not immune. A single traveler could introduce the disease, triggering outbreaks that would unfold with alarming speed. The virus exploited patterns of human activity that were essential to daily life and wartime logistics, making containment extraordinarily difficult. Public awareness of the disease remained uneven. Wartime censorship in Europe suppressed information that could have alerted civilians and policymakers to the emerging threat. In the United States, reporting was less restricted, but the significance of the early outbreaks was often misunderstood or dismissed as routine seasonal influenza. Newspapers offered fragmented accounts, occasionally emphasizing mild recoveries or attributing deaths to secondary infections without acknowledging the broader pattern. For most people, life continued under the assumption that influenza, though inconvenient, remained a manageable seasonal illness. This mismatch between perception and reality would prove catastrophic as the pandemic escalated. Within hospitals, medical staff faced extraordinary pressures. In urban centers, wards quickly filled with patients exhibiting rapid-onset respiratory distress. Nurses and doctors, working under exhausting conditions, attempted to provide care with limited resources. Hospitals struggled to isolate the most severe cases, and infection often spread among patients and staff alike. Observations from these early experiences were meticulously recorded, forming the basis for later epidemiological studies. But at the time, each outbreak represented a crisis managed in real time, with decisions often guided by instinct and experience rather than comprehensive scientific understanding. The social ramifications of these outbreaks became increasingly visible. Families experienced simultaneous illness among multiple members, disrupting household routines and economic stability. Local economies were affected as workers fell ill and could not attend factories, farms, or offices. Religious and social gatherings, traditionally central to community cohesion, were disrupted and public anxiety began to rise. Yet despite these signs, governments were slow to implement widespread interventions, constrained by wartime priorities and limited understanding of the disease's dynamics. Communities learned, through experience, that traditional social and medical structures were insufficient to contain the threat. By late summer, the virus's pattern of lethality became unmistakable. Unlike earlier influenza seasons, where mortality primarily affected the very young and very old, this strain exhibited a distinct and horrifying preference for healthy young adults. Epidemiologists would later identify this as a cytokine storm, an overreaction of the immune system, which explained why those with robust immunity were sometimes more vulnerable than those with weaker defenses. At the time, however, this phenomenon was entirely mysterious. Physicians could only observe the outcomes, record symptoms, and attempt to manage the human suffering they could not prevent. The unpredictability intensified fear and uncertainty among both medical professionals and the broader public. As influenza continued to spread, it became clear that traditional public health measures were insufficient. Quarantines were attempted, but difficult to enforce, particularly in densely populated areas or military settings. Mask mandates were inconsistently applied, and compliance varied, depending on public understanding and trust in authorities. Efforts to limit gatherings had only partial success, and the virus adapted easily to the mobility and connectivity of human society. In this environment, the disease exploited both structural and behavioral vulnerabilities, demonstrating a capacity for transmission and impact that exceeded any previously observed influenza strain. Across continents, similar patterns emerged. Military units in Europe experienced waves of illness that mirrored those in the United States, often delayed by weeks, but following the same characteristics: rapid onset, severe respiratory symptoms, high mortality among young adults, and the potential for secondary bacterial complications. Civilian populations in cities such as London, Paris, and Madrid began to encounter influenza with similar consequences. Global interconnectedness, already accelerated by wartime trade and troop movements, allowed the virus to traverse oceans and continents, linking distant populations through invisible biological threads. Despite growing evidence of its severity, the full scope of the pandemic remained obscured. Reporting was inconsistent, scientific understanding was incomplete, and governments were reluctant to create public alarm during wartime. Influenza, in this context, became a crisis unfolding silently, shaping human experience in ways that would only later be fully recognized. Communities were learning through observation, trial, and tragedy that the disease was not a seasonal inconvenience, but a global threat capable of overwhelming social, medical, and logistical systems simultaneously. By the end of the summer, the virus had revealed its essential nature. Highly transmissible, capable of striking the healthy as well as the vulnerable, and able to exploit the social and structural conditions created by war. It had moved from isolated outbreaks to widespread dissemination, and its lethality could no longer be ignored. Physicians, public health officials, and communities were forced to confront a fundamental reality. The virus was a new kind of adversary, one that would require adaptation, innovation, and extraordinary human resilience to endure. In retrospect, this period represents the first clear emergence of the pandemic's power. The virus had transformed from a collection of local outbreaks into a global force, revealing both the limitations of contemporary medicine and the vulnerabilities inherent in human societies. It demonstrated how interconnectedness, while essential to economic and social life, could become a vector for catastrophe. It revealed the fragility of medical infrastructure in the face of a novel pathogen, and it highlighted the importance of observation, documentation, and public awareness in shaping effective responses. The early months of the pandemic were thus both a warning and a prelude, setting the stage for the subsequent waves of illness that would define 1918 and leave an indelible mark on human history. By the autumn of 1918, influenza had begun to reveal its capacity not only to claim individual lives, but to strain entire urban centers in ways that were unprecedented. Cities, already swollen with soldiers returning from the front, industrial laborers drawn to factories, and displaced populations seeking safety or employment, became tinderboxes for contagion. Overcrowded housing, poor sanitation, and inadequate ventilation created environments in which the virus could move effortlessly from person to person. Streets and public transportation systems, once emblematic of modern urban life, now facilitated rapid transmission, turning every interaction into a potential risk. The infrastructure that had once symbolized progress now amplified vulnerability. Hospitals, the central pillars of urban health, began to buckle under the pressure. Wards designed for hundreds of patients found themselves accommodating thousands. Staff, many of whom had already been overextended by wartime demands, were pushed to the limits of endurance. Nurses worked double shifts, physicians were summoned from other regions, and makeshift facilities were established in schools, auditoriums, and even private homes to cope with the surge of cases. Despite these extraordinary efforts, medical care remained largely supportive. Treatments could alleviate symptoms, provide comfort, and sometimes prevent secondary infections, but there was no cure for the virus itself. Mortality was especially high among young adults, a demographic typically considered robust, and this reality sent shockwaves through communities unaccustomed to seeing the most vital members of society succumb in such numbers. Public health authorities faced logistical and ethical dilemmas unprecedented in scale. Cities attempted to implement isolation measures, sometimes closing schools, theaters, and places of worship, and imposing restrictions on public gatherings. Yet enforcement was inconsistent, and compliance varied, depending on socioeconomic conditions, public understanding, and trust in local government. In dense working-class neighborhoods, the feasibility of isolation was limited by the practicalities of daily life. Families shared small apartments, Multiple generations lived under one roof, and many residents relied on daily labor to survive. In this context, attempts at containment were often ineffective, and the virus continued to spread with relentless efficiency. The psychological impact of the pandemic on urban populations was profound. Individuals faced the constant threat of illness, not only to themselves but to family members, neighbors, and colleagues. Social rituals, from shopping at markets to attending religious services, were disrupted. Communities experienced a pervasive sense of anxiety, amplified by the unpredictability of the disease. While some residents remained unaware of the severity of the situation, others observed its devastating effects firsthand as illness swept through entire neighborhoods in a matter of days. The city, a hub of human connection and activity, had become a landscape of vulnerability where routine interactions carried unforeseen risk. Transportation networks, emblematic of urban modernity, became significant vectors of disease. Streetcars, trains, and subways, often crowded and poorly ventilated, allowed the virus to leapfrog across city blocks and between neighborhoods. Workers commuting to factories and offices inadvertently carried the disease into their workplaces, perpetuating transmission cycles that were difficult to interrupt. Port cities faced additional challenges, as incoming ships brought both goods and people from other regions, introducing new opportunities for infection. The complexity of urban networks, once a testament to human ingenuity, now underscored the challenges of controlling a rapidly spreading pathogen. The workforce, critical to sustaining urban economies during wartime, was deeply affected. Factories operating around the clock to meet military demands experienced high absenteeism as workers fell ill or tended to sick family members. Production slowed, schedules were disrupted, and in some cases, essential goods were delayed. Urban economies, already fragile from the strains of war, were further destabilized by the combined pressures of illness, labor shortages, and the uncertainty surrounding public health measures. The virus revealed the interdependence of social, economic, and health systems, demonstrating how a biological threat could ripple through every layer of urban life. Medical professionals in cities were faced with impossible choices. Hospitals overflowed, beds were scarce, and medical supplies were limited. Physicians and nurses had to prioritize care, often deciding who could receive treatment and who could only be observed. The ethical weight of these decisions was immense, and the emotional toll on medical staff was compounded by their own risk of infection. The virus's rapid progression left little time for intervention, and the high mortality rate among otherwise healthy adults further heightened the sense of helplessness. Despite these challenges, healthcare workers continued to provide care, documenting cases and observing patterns that would later inform public health strategies and scientific understanding. Public communication presented another significant challenge. Wartime censorship and limited media coverage obscured the scale of the outbreak, leaving residents with incomplete or inconsistent information. In some cities, newspapers reported only sporadically on illness and mortality, while government advisories were sometimes vague, emphasizing personal hygiene or isolation without acknowledging the severity of the pandemic. This gap in understanding contributed to confusion, fear, and inconsistent adherence to public health measures. Communities were forced to navigate an invisible threat with limited guidance, relying on observation, personal judgment, and shared experience to respond to a crisis that was both immediate and incomprehensible. Social inequities further amplified the impact of the pandemic in urban areas. Poorer neighborhoods, with crowded housing and limited access to medical care, experienced disproportionately high infection and mortality rates. Wealthier districts, while better equipped to isolate the sick and access medical resources, were not immune to the psychological and economic disruptions caused by widespread illness. These disparities underscored the vulnerability of populations with limited means to protect themselves, highlighting how social structures and economic conditions could influence health outcomes during a pandemic. The city itself, a symbol of progress and human achievement, became a complex stage on which the pandemic unfolded. Streets, once bustling with commerce and social activity, were now sites of uncertainty and risk. Markets, theaters, schools, and factories were disrupted, altering the rhythm of daily life. Families confronted the constant possibility of illness, sometimes losing multiple members within days. The virus exploited the dense social fabric of urban centers, revealing both the strengths and limitations of modern infrastructure. Public spaces designed for efficiency and connectivity now facilitated the spread of disease, demonstrating the unintended consequences of human organization in the face of a novel pathogen. Despite the overwhelming challenges, urban communities exhibited resilience. Volunteers established temporary care facilities, neighbors assisted one another with provisions, and local authorities experimented with public health measures such as staggered work shifts, temporary closures of public spaces, and improved sanitation. These efforts, while limited in effectiveness, reflected the adaptability and resourcefulness of urban populations facing a crisis of unprecedented scale. Communities learned, through experience, about the importance of coordination, communication, and mutual support in mitigating the impact of a rapidly spreading disease. By late autumn, the virus had established itself as a persistent and pervasive threat in cities worldwide. Its capacity to spread rapidly, incapacitate healthy adults, and overwhelm medical infrastructure challenged conventional understanding of influenza. Hospitals remained crowded, medical staff continued to work under extreme pressure, and public health measures were only partially effective. The social, economic, and psychological consequences of the pandemic were becoming increasingly evident, revealing the deep vulnerabilities of urban life in an era of unprecedented connectivity and population density. In retrospect, this period highlights the intersection of biology, society, and infrastructure. Influenza exploited the very networks that define modern cities: dense housing, mass transportation, and interconnected economies, demonstrating how human activity could facilitate the spread of disease. The pandemic exposed the limitations of medical knowledge and public health systems, underscoring the need for coordinated, well-informed responses to emergent pathogens. The experience of urban centers in 1918 provides a lens through which to understand the broader dynamics of the pandemic, illustrating how local conditions, social structures, and human behavior collectively shaped the trajectory and impact of a global crisis. The strain on urban centers also had enduring consequences. Mortality among working-age adults disrupted families, economies, and social networks. Hospitals, overwhelmed and understaffed, faced long-term challenges in capacity and preparedness. Public health systems began to recognize the importance of surveillance, communication, and rapid response, laying the groundwork for future advances in epidemiology and pandemic preparedness. In this sense, the crisis of 1918 was not only a story of loss and disruption, but also a catalyst for reflection, innovation, and adaptation within urban societies confronting a novel and deadly threat. Ultimately, the experience of cities in the autumn of 1918 exemplifies the complex interplay between disease and society. Influenza revealed how human connectivity, infrastructure, and social organization could both support and undermine resilience in the face of a pandemic. The virus's relentless spread challenged medical authority, tested community solidarity, and transformed daily life. Yet it also illuminated the capacity for human ingenuity, compassion, and adaptability in confronting a crisis that defied precedent. The lessons learned in these urban centers would inform both contemporary understanding and future responses, shaping the collective memory of a pandemic that reshaped the modern world. As the influenza pandemic advanced through the late months of 1918, the challenge of the virus was compounded by human decisions, particularly those made by governments and institutions struggling to maintain order during wartime. Censorship, designed to protect morale and preserve public confidence, became an unexpected ally to the virus. In Europe, where nations were weary from years of conflict, the reporting of disease outbreaks was heavily filtered, Newspapers were restricted from publishing alarming statistics or accounts of mass illness, and official statements often downplayed the severity of local outbreaks. The public was left with partial or misleading information, unable to grasp the true scale of the threat surrounding them. This lack of transparency slowed communal understanding and delayed appropriate responses, allowing the virus to spread more efficiently through populations that remained unaware of the danger. In cities across the globe, the consequences of such censorship were profound. People went about their daily routines under the assumption that influenza was a manageable seasonal illness, unaware of the extraordinary mortality rate it carried. In factories, schools, markets, and transit systems, individuals continued to congregate in crowded spaces, inadvertently facilitating transmission. Families, trusting official reassurances, often failed to implement isolation measures that might have mitigated spread. As illness proliferated, the psychological weight of uncertainty intensified. Rumors circulated in the absence of reliable information, fueling anxiety and speculation. In this environment, misinformation and silence proved as consequential as the virus itself, shaping behavior in ways that inadvertently amplified its impact. The press, constrained by censorship and the demands of wartime reporting, sometimes attempted to provide guidance without causing panic. Newspapers offered advice on personal hygiene, rest, and avoidance of large gatherings. But these measures were often insufficient given the virus's virulence and rapid transmission. The public, accustomed to trusting authority and conventional wisdom, often followed guidance inconsistently or too late. Social norms, developed around prior seasonal influenza patterns, were inadequate for a disease capable of incapacitating entire families or communities in days. This mismatch between perception and reality contributed to the virus's insidious reach, allowing it to move rapidly through densely populated and highly mobile populations. Governments faced a delicate balancing act. On one hand, there was a need to maintain morale, particularly in nations still engaged in the final campaigns of the First World War. Panic, seen as potentially disruptive to military and economic stability, had to be avoided. On the other hand, public health authorities were beginning to recognize the extraordinary severity of the influenza outbreaks and the need for proactive measures. The tension between these priorities resulted in inconsistent policies, delayed interventions, and often contradictory messaging. Quarantines, temporary closures, and hygiene campaigns were applied unevenly, leaving many communities vulnerable to rapid transmission. The virus, indifferent to political or social priorities, exploited every gap in human organization. One of the most striking consequences of censorship and limited public awareness was the role of misinformation in shaping responses. In the absence of clear data, speculation about causes and cures spread rapidly. Folk remedies, untested treatments, and protective measures of questionable efficacy were widely circulated. Some communities embraced these methods with fervent belief, while others dismissed official advice, perceiving it as incomplete or untrustworthy. The virus, meanwhile, continued its course, unaffected by human uncertainty, but amplified by social behavior driven by incomplete knowledge. This interplay between biological reality and social perception became a defining feature of the pandemic, demonstrating how information, or the lack thereof, could influence outcomes as profoundly as the pathogen itself. Medical professionals were not immune to the challenges posed by censorship and limited knowledge. Hospitals were overwhelmed, resources strained, and staff exhausted. Physicians relied on observational data to inform their decisions, but the fragmented reporting of cases hindered the development of a coherent understanding of transmission dynamics. Even the most diligent practitioners faced ethical dilemmas. How to prioritize care when resources were insufficient, how to advise the public without triggering panic, and how to reconcile the demands of professional duty with the limitations imposed by external control of information. The pandemic exposed the vulnerability not only of populations at large, but of the very institutions tasked with protecting them. In urban centers, the interplay between censorship, misinformation, and the virus's spread was particularly evident. Cities with high population density experienced rapid, often unpredictable outbreaks. Transportation networks, essential to economic and social life, became vectors for transmission, yet public awareness of the risk was minimal. Crowded streetcars, theaters, markets, and workplaces continued to function as though influenza were a minor inconvenience. Families, neighbors, and coworkers were exposed daily, unknowingly participating in the propagation of the virus. Public health interventions, limited by resources and constrained by communication barriers, struggled to keep pace with the speed and scope of infection. Social behavior, shaped by incomplete understanding, often exacerbated the crisis. Communities clung to routines and traditions, from market visits to religious observances, despite warnings that gatherings increased risk. Fear, speculation, and rumor influenced decision-making, sometimes leading to counterproductive responses. In some cases, mistrust of official guidance led individuals to ignore basic health recommendations, while in others, extreme measures were taken based on anecdotal reports or unverified claims. The virus, indifferent to social or political context, exploited these behaviors, demonstrating how the interplay of biology, society, and perception could magnify its impact. Rural communities, while less densely populated, faced parallel challenges. News of outbreaks arrived slowly, often through word of mouth or delayed reports from local authorities. Traditional remedies and folk practices were commonly employed in the absence of formal medical guidance. Isolation was difficult to implement in farming households reliant on collective labor for survival. The virus, once introduced into these areas, could devastate small populations quickly, with limited capacity for medical intervention. The combination of geographical isolation, delayed information, and reliance on informal practices created vulnerabilities that mirrored, in different form, those seen in urban centers. The cumulative effect of censorship, misinformation, and limited public awareness was profound. Influenza moved rapidly through populations, exploiting both structural and social vulnerabilities. Mortality was high among the demographic that formed the backbone of society: young adults and working-age individuals. Families, communities, and institutions were forced to navigate the pandemic largely in the dark, making decisions with incomplete or inaccurate information. This dynamic magnified the virus's lethality and complicated the efforts of public health authorities, creating conditions in which the biological threat and the informational environment combined to produce unprecedented societal disruption. Medical institutions, in response, adapted in real time. Hospitals established triage protocols, isolation wards, and rudimentary surveillance systems to track the spread of illness. Nurses and physicians worked tirelessly under extreme pressure, often at great personal risk, documenting cases and observing patterns that would later inform scientific understanding. Despite limited resources and incomplete information, the dedication of medical personnel mitigated some suffering and provided essential care to communities facing an overwhelming threat. These early efforts laid the groundwork for future public health strategies and demonstrated the critical importance of institutional knowledge, coordination, and resilience in the face of emergent pandemics. By the end of 1918, the interplay of censorship, misinformation, and public health challenges had revealed fundamental truths about society's vulnerability to novel pathogens. Populations were interconnected in ways that facilitated rapid transmission, while institutions charged with monitoring and mitigating disease were constrained by social, political, and informational factors. The virus exploited both biological susceptibility and systemic gaps, demonstrating that effective pandemic response requires not only medical knowledge, but transparent communication, public trust, and social cooperation. These lessons, painfully learned in real time, would shape the strategies employed in subsequent global health crises. In retrospect, this phase of the pandemic illustrates how human decisions can influence the trajectory of disease as profoundly as the pathogen itself. Censorship, intended to preserve morale and social order, inadvertently allowed the virus to move undetected. Misinformation, arising from uncertainty and incomplete knowledge, influence behavior in ways that sometimes worsen outcomes. Public health interventions, while well-intentioned, were often hampered by social and logistical constraints. Influenza's spread during this period highlights the complex interplay between biology, society, and information, underscoring that pandemics are not merely biological events, but social phenomena that unfold within the context of human behavior and institutional capacity. Ultimately, the autumn of 1918 demonstrated that the challenge of influenza was not solely medical. It was also informational, social, and institutional. The virus revealed the limits of knowledge, the consequences of constrained communication, and the critical importance of public trust and cooperation. Communities, faced with an invisible and unpredictable threat, were forced to adapt, innovate, and persevere, often learning lessons at the cost of profound human suffering. The dynamics of censorship, misinformation, and societal response in this period would leave enduring marks on the understanding of public health, shaping both contemporary and future approaches to disease control and crisis management. As the calendar turned to the late months of 1918, influenza entered a new and far more devastating phase, often referred to in hindsight as the second wave. Unlike the first wave, which had been relatively mild and sporadic, this phase struck with alarming intensity and lethality, catching societies across the globe off guard. Military camps, cities, and rural communities alike faced the sudden onset of illness that moved with a speed and severity previously unseen. Hospitals were overwhelmed almost immediately, and public health systems, already strained by the dual pressures of war and the earlier phase of the pandemic, struggled to cope. The virus demonstrated that it had evolved, or perhaps simply revealed the full scope of its virulence, in a way that would define the pandemic's deadliest period. The nature of the virus during this second wave was particularly striking. Individuals who had survived earlier outbreaks were sometimes susceptible to reinfection, and mortality rates among young, healthy adults surged dramatically. Physicians began to document what would later be understood as immune overreaction, a cytokine storm, where the body's own defenses exacerbated the damage caused by the virus. Previously robust individuals, often in the prime of life, found themselves incapacitated within hours, their lungs filling with fluid, their respiratory systems overwhelmed. Medical staff, though experienced from the first wave, were unprepared for the scale and intensity of these cases. The rapid progression left little time for intervention, and supportive care alone could not prevent death in many instances. Urban centers bore the brunt of the second wave. Cities that had previously experienced moderate outbreaks now confronted mass illness. Crowded hospitals overflowed, wards were converted into temporary care facilities, and volunteers worked tirelessly to provide basic support. Transportation networks, schools, factories, and public gathering places became vectors for transmission. Public health authorities implemented closures and quarantines where possible, but compliance was uneven, and enforcement was often impractical given the scale of the crisis. The virus exploited every weakness in urban infrastructure, demonstrating how human connectivity and mobility could amplify biological threats.